Good evening. This is Mae Brussell and Carmel. This is November the 17th, 1978, and it's tape number 363, side 1. Last week on the tape, accompanying the tape, I sent a map of Poland, and I wanted to make a correction there. I did have another world atlas that I didn't bring in because this was such a clear close-up, but where number 1 is where Katowice is, with the arrow pointing to Katowice. Wadowice and Katowice I mistook for the same place because Krakow is spelled both with a C and a K. But if you take your pencil or look at an atlas, Wadowice, the home of the current Pope John Paul II, is right between Auschwitz and Krakow. Auschwitz is Auschwitz. And he's right next to the camp at Auschwitz, and he lived in the town of Krakow part of his life and Wadowice when he was younger. So put him right between Auschwitz and Krakow instead of to the left where Katowice is. You can make that correction on your little map. There was a lot of speculation in the news about the death of Pope John Paul, and I'll share some of those headlines with you in case you didn't see all of them. We'll go through some of those on this tape. And of course, when somebody dies so suddenly and has no autopsy and so many discrepancies, it is immediately mandatory to study who succeeds that person and comes in line next, because if there is a murder, then there's a total change of policy, political policy, and then we must follow that successor. And when I heard that Pope John Paul II had come from Poland and was handpicked by Mr. Zabriskie and the National Security Council, of course, the links of him to the Bilderbergers and the Trilateral are so strong, and that this was a fellow Landsman from Poland, that they knew each other, and knowing the position of Zabriskie in the Cold War, I began to do some work into this Pole. It wasn't hard because there were stories in the newspaper about the chemical factory that he worked at and the quarry he worked at, and locating the town and where he was. Of course, I was frightened that he had worked at Auschwitz, and I think it matters to the world in general to know just what he was doing from the ages of 19 to 25 and what his position was. The headlines and articles have said he helped some Jews, but I very seriously doubt that he would be selected by the most extreme right-wing cardinals and Mr. Brzezinski and the people around him if he was saving Jews during World War II. I don't think he would have lived very long, and he was spared. And I called Bob Trevor on KGO, that's a talk radio show here in San Francisco, the night before the ceremony, bringing in the Pope. I want to say the inauguration, because he's really like an American president, as far as I can see, a puppet of these powers that be hand-selected. I called Bob Trevor on KGO and just brought up the question that I was not able to find through many telephone calls where he did in fact work in Poland. I didn't originate the idea that the Catholic Church was fascist. There's many, many books about it, and with that movie, The Holocaust, on television, long series for people to get introduced to exactly what Auschwitz was, I thought it was a pertinent question to ask on the radio if we could find out where the new Pope worked. And Bob Trevor was taken by surprise. It was a late-night call, and he immediately said, "Don't send your letters to me. I'll give them to May. I don't want to get in the middle of this." And he passed it off and was running scared. And he sent me a package of mail that he got about this question, and some of it was very supportive. And I'm going to read you one letter because, of course, these cowards sent unsigned letters, no return address. Well, he signs it, Joe America, just Joe America. And this is the letter that he wrote, dated October 21st, 1978. Bob, why do you allow yourself to be involved with Mae Brussell? She's vicious and evil and is connected with the Communist Party, the local party, namely the Russian Council. She's using KGO as her sounding board for the Russian Council. She spreads and spews out propaganda about the CIA, and the FBI. She spreads outlandish lies about decent citizens and that much crucified man, Richard Nixon. Now she's taking after the Pope. The Kremlin is livid because a Pole has been chosen for Pope. They cannot stand having this man as Pope. Personally, I fear for his life. If they cannot smear his good name and discredit him, they will assassinate him. Their fears for all their satellites, these Catholic countries such as Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Poland, Russia, have tried to keep God from these countries for 30 years. They've tried, and they have failed. There's 100 million people who are Catholic in Eastern Europe in these fine countries. I forgot to mention Hungary. Can you understand the Soviets' fear? If you cannot, you are a fool. But maybe you understand and deliberately want to help smear this good man. Maybe you are part of the plan. Take care that you don't end up with a sick brain like Ted Gandolfo and Mae Brussell, who's next. You'll see. I'll hear it in her hate for this country. I hear it in her hate for this country. Your hate shows more and more. Your voice becomes livid when anyone tries to rebut your radical views. It shows over the airways, Bob. Mae Brussell is reaching the end of her trail, on her trail of hate and destruction. If you're smart, steer clear of this vicious bitch. The powers that be have given her a lot of rope. They've been lenient so far. But so far, he has, in quotation marks, is not forever. Remember these words. Her family has disavowed her. They don't want or have anything to do with her. Her family is the Magnum family, a fine, civic-minded, upright family. She's a disgrace and a troublemaker. All the other communicasters will have nothing to do with this dangerous woman. Either you're soft in the head or you're working hand in hand. Signed, listener Joe America. He's talking about the San Francisco branch of Magnums. My grandfather, my father's father, was married to my grandmother, and he also had another woman at the same time and divorced my grandmother. And I never even saw the San Francisco Magnums. I've never even met them. My family, parents are friendly with them now. They were never part of my childhood, except for my immediate grandmother, my father's mother. And we never had any part of them. They never supported my father, helped him through school or through his training or anything. They just latched on to him when he was well-known and famous in later years. When he was 70 years old or 75, they made contact with him. And there's been no disassociation with me from the Magnum family because I've never even shaken hands with them, and that's how far removed he is from the facts. But the interesting thing in here, I think, is that he says that she's reaching her end, and he mentions Ted Gandolfo, and says Mae Brussell will be next, because I feel that Ted was compromised. He had a television show in New York every week, and he was a very good researcher who was tape recording all the various speeches of different people involved in the assassinations and calling radio talk shows. And then all of a sudden one evening in May, he just went kaput. He had called me that day. He used to call me every single day from New York. And now he is like a basket case. And this man mentioned that and said that they've given her enough rope. And maybe the things that I'm feeling, the threats I'm feeling, are coming in from this kind of person, because he signs his name Joe American and says, but so far isn't forever. Remember these words. And I feel that the station is monitored, and they will see how far I go and then probably want to take some steps. That's why I didn't want to go up to KGO in person and be on the show a month ago or so. In order to study the politics of the Vatican and the shenanigans going on, the manipulation of nations and fascism, you have to take an overlay of the various popes, Pope Pius XI in 1922, who came in just at the time that Germany and Italy were rearming, and he was the Pope until 1939. That was through the years of the Spanish Civil War and the approval of Mussolini and Hitler sending in troops into Spain. And of course, Cardinal Pacelli was behind that and was supporting that all along. 1939, Cardinal Pacelli became the Pope. Just at the time when Germany was ready to invade Poland, he took over just prior to that, and he had been given notice by the Germans that they were going into Poland, and they had already signed an agreement in 1929 that the Vatican would not interfere with the invasion of countries or with any form of fascism. That was called the Treatment of Conciliation, February the 11th, 1929. And that was the conditions by which the Vatican became extremely wealthy in property and various holdings when Mussolini, the premier of Italy, made a deal and gave $100 million to the Vatican and Italian industry if they would remain neutral. Now, that wasn't much to invest because they were going to pillage all these countries of Eastern Europe of all their wealth, their art, gold, labor, slave labor, and various minerals and products. So 100 million went to the Vatican because the great deal of these people in the East there were Catholics, and they could tell them to submit and give in to Hitler as he came through, which they did, and there was no speech from the church to stop them. In exchange for all of these goodies, this 100 million and lots of acres and buildings and so forth, the treatment of conciliation kept the Pope neutral while World War II went on, and they were silent about the deaths and the invasions. In 1958, when Pope Pius XII died, we had John XXIII, who was a very kind gentleman who got along with John Kennedy and Khrushchev, and it almost looked like a renaissance at the end of the war years. The deaths of the popes are interesting in addition to their political alliances, because John the 23rd, who was close to John Kennedy, died June 3rd, 1963. And in November, John Kennedy would be dead. And then Brazil, which is largely all of Latin and South America is Catholic, was overthrown with a military dictatorship. And the Dominican Republic then was overthrown. And, of course, the intelligence community that had killed John Kennedy had taken over all of Central and South America, with the exception of Cuba, I suppose. And this death of John was in June 3rd, 1963, and then came Pope Paul VI. That's the secretary to Pius XII, the Pope who was in through the entire war from 1939, the invasion of Poland on through all those years. And he was secretary to the Vatican, and I've mentioned before, writing passports for Nazis to Central and South America. The history, the overlay of what was happening and when these men came into power is terribly important. And then for that brief, short period of time, we had John Paul I. Andrew Greeley, a writer from Chicago studying the Catholic Church himself, he's a Roman Catholic priest himself, wrote 3 articles in the Los Angeles Times. I've given you the dates, very good ones. And the very first one, right after the death of John Paul I, is called The Papacy, From Promise to Uncertainty. And I think that could be the title of an article after John Kennedy was killed, What Do We Do Now? And he says in this first article that these new Pope John Paul I did away with a lot of the trappings of the papacy, the throne, the crown, the majestic we. And he said before the next pope was chosen, there are no more albino Lucianos lurking in the hills of northern Italy. He was elected by a strange coalition, an alliance of the left and the moderate against the far right. And he says that there were 20 votes of the far right, the extremist group, which didn't go to Luciano, and they didn't vote for anybody. They were outnumbered, and so they didn't write their name on the ballot at all. They were left blank, and the reason they were left blank was to protest. The dissenters, he said, were an extreme group of conservatives who served warning by withholding their votes. They warned Pope Paul VI that the new pope had no universal mandate. And he goes on to say that Pope John Paul started with the support of the Third World and some progressive Northern Europeans from France, Belgium, the Dutch, and a few from Brazil, and moderate Italians, but he started with a tough warning from the traditionalists, members of the Roman Curia, and then he said in his article on October the 1st, 1978, in quotes, there will be another election, but this time It may not be a religious experience for anyone. Right off the bat, there were discrepancies in the Pope's death. Newsweek said without any warning, a heart attack ended his sunny reign, and Time magazine was saying he died of a massive stroke. His last words were supposed to have been regarding a right-wing student who was killed. They kill each other, even the young people. And another account said, are those people shooting themselves again? This really is terrible. The story goes that the Secretary of the Vatican, Cardinal Jean Villot, smashed the ring that the Pope was wearing, the traditional ring with the inlaid seal, smashed it with a hammer, and then there's another account that the papal ring wasn't smashed because there wasn't time to make one for him. There's an account that he was propped up on pillows, half-sitting position with the reading lamp still on, and then there were accounts that he was slumped forward in bed with his face pressed into open books. Some accounts said that his face was contorted, robbed of a serene smile that many had found endearing, and other stories said that the smile that earned him the reputation around the world as a smiling Pope was on his face. UPI story, it was a miracle. His face was absolutely serene. Here was a man with a massive heart attack whose face was as calm itself. His body was discovered by Sister Vincenza, a nun from the Child Mary Institute, and then again his body was discovered by the Pope's secretary, Father John McGee. When the UPI reporters tried to interview Father McGee or Sister Vincenza, they were told that they were not available, that Father McGee had left the country, and that journalists couldn't interview either one of them to see who was there first. One report in the Rome newspaper said that his body was indicative of someone who got a fatal dose of a South American drug, curare, which is a muscle relaxant and causes cessation of all body functions. And on the other hand, the Vatican physician said he had a massive heart attack or stroke, which is almost impossible to die with a smile on your face because you do have some pain, just grasping at the time of that trauma. He was supposed to be in bed reading Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ, a medieval book of devotions. Later it was said he was reading personal writings, and the Vatican City on October the 3rd, 1978, said the Vatican radio clarified reports about what the Pope was doing when his fatal attack came. He was not reading as announced, but he was holding pieces of paper, some personal writings. When he was elected, it was announced that he was in good health. He had a complete physical examination and was in excellent health. After he died, they said that he was a sick man. The Washington Post, October the 2nd, 1978, wrote an article and said, sources said that in our modern era, the late Cardinal Eugene Tisserand of France, Dean of the Sacred College of Cardinals, believed that his patron, Pope Pius XI, was murdered. When Pope Pius XI died in 1939, Tisserand contended he was about to denounce the Vatican's 1929 Concordat with Italy's fascist government. The year 1939 is when Jack Ruby moved from Los Angeles to Chicago, become secretary of the Waste Handlers Union, when the FBI, headed by J. Edgar Hoover, joined Interpol July 20th, 1939, which was headed by Meyer Heydrich, the man who came up with the idea for I.G. Farben of the solution of the Jewish problem of killing the Jews. That was the year that the FBI joined into the international police that was headed by the Nazi organizations. That's the year that Howard Hughes personally met Charles Lindbergh. It was the end of the Spanish Republic. It was the turning point of Hitler's career, his conquest in the Czechoslovakian area. It's when Roosevelt was asked by Hitler and Mussolini to sign a non-aggression pact and the German invasion of Poland in September of 1939. It seems all right for the Washington Post to write an article about the possible murder of Pope Pius XI during that crucial year, but you can't say these things on KGO. Let's According to UPI, Pope John Paul was very happy. The night before he died, he was laughing, he was talking and smiling, and there wasn't a sign, not a single sign of anything wrong, according to Monsignor Jacques Martin, prefect of the household. Cardinal Villot was with him the last night. He's also the man who was supposed to have smashed the non-existent ring. He said they had a good dinner together, he with his secretaries. At 9 o'clock, he called a friend in Milan and talked to him, and they talked a long time, and he went to bed and was reading, which was his custom. The Cardinal Villot was Secretary of the State. He might still be, I think he is. He immediately assumed leadership of the Pope, which he did when Pope Paul VI died on August the 6th, 1978. The cause of death was a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, which according to a UPI story is impossible to diagnose without autopsy. There have been cases in the United States where bodies were exhumed and curare that deadly drug in them, and the original diagnosis of the coroner and the doctors at the time was heart attack. Without an autopsy, it's impossible to determine the cause of death, even though they said it was heart attack. And then they also said there was a hemorrhage, a blood hemorrhage. As soon as the Pope was dead, there were many articles in the United States as well as in Italy about his death. I have one here from the Las Vegas Sun, which states several Italian newspapers Saturday and Sunday took issue with the Vatican's decision not to order an autopsy or to confirm the physician's findings that the Pope had died of a heart attack. The press quoted the medical authorities as saying that it could only be an autopsy that could determine such a sudden cause of death, which started the newspaper rumors to spread in various parts of Italy that the Pope may have fallen victim to some kind of foul play. The UPI story in the Los Angeles Times said evidence claimed for Pope death inquiry. A conservative Catholic organization said Friday it has concrete evidence to back demands for the investigation of possible foul play in the death of Pope John Paul I. They will work through the Vatican to avoid a scandal. There are 50,000 members of this organization in 21 countries, and they are considering bringing charges of murder. We have concrete evidence that demand our investigation. We want to observe the legal niceties and work through the Vatican, they said. The Vatican has an independent legal system, which is different than in Rome. Neither the Pope nor the cardinals that are in power now should be able to stop it. This is October the 10th, 1978, UPI. It went on, people all over the world are asking the same questions. Where are the facts? Where are the answers? Where is the death certificate? The Vatican line about not being able to give an autopsy is a colossal lie. Autopsies have been done on popes in the past. That's Los Angeles Times. They had another article, October the 6th, in the Los Angeles Times, with a lead article titled, "Like everyone else, the papal electors must consider bills and blood pressure." And it said people are bringing up the possibility of poison in connection with Pope John Paul's death. The doctors are still complaining that Pope Paul VI need not have died. He could have used intensive care therapy. Others are wondering when the last time was that Papa Luciana had his blood pressure taken. If massive brain hemorrhage, then it meant high blood pressure. Newspaper writers with the curial connections, and we'll go into the curia, have said the strain of being a pope was too great for the man with no experience in the Vatican, but meanwhile there's a search being made for his health records, which is not available. Why no physical exams for candidates? Why no autopsy in times of sudden death? Autopsies would put to rest foolish rumors. Dignity and the importance of the office should make accurate information about the state of a candidate's health absolutely essential. That's the Los Angeles Times. A small newspaper called The Spotlight said there would be no use for an autopsy, even though they had a long article on the possible murder of the Pope, because nobody can be charged with murder. There is no way any Italian authority could charge anyone with murder in the Vatican City. This is an independent state in the city of Rome, and it's impossible to have any jurisdiction over it. Again, that goes back to 1929, the agreement that the Vatican could be a law unto itself from then on, and nobody could be charged with murder inside the Vatican, of course. The UPI had a story, October the 4th, 1978, called No Autopsy. The Vatican has said no autopsies will be performed. It was the orders of Pope Paul VI in 1975 regarding papal transitions that no autopsies would be allowed. I think I mentioned that last week on the tape. The New York News has an article by Pete Hamill, October the 14th, 1978, titled The Plausible Melodrama of a Poisoned Pope. And these are some of the quotations. The sudden end of his reign remains clouded with suspicion. Unlucky Luciana might have been knocked off. The conservatives see a dark blood hand of the communists. The left sees the much longer tradition of infamy that belongs to the conservatives. Years ago, Pete Hamill wrote a thriller called A Killing for Christ, but he said, never in recent times have there been so many deaths of such a sudden nature, so close together as in the Vatican. Much of the so-called real world has come to resemble the structure of fiction. And of course, we can do the overlay of history. Never before have there been so many close deaths, such as Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Medgar Evans, Whitney Young, Adlai Stevenson, a whole list of deaths, a litany of deaths of people that had something in common, a thread of decency running through them. Pete Hamill went on, the revelations about the CIA have disclosed that real men with real guns have imaginations more lurid than any mere writers. These are respectable people who make alliances with the mafia, a gang of perverted killers to murder Fidel Castro, and God knows what else they dreamed of. Now Italy has changed, and since its birth in 1945, Italy's Christian Democratic Party has been an ally of the Vatican. This was immediately at the end of the war when the Christian Democratic Party became friends of the Vatican, and again, that's when these passports were being written for these Nazi war criminals by Secretary Montini, who went on to be the Pope. The Vatican was very active in relocating them in Central South America, Africa, Asia, and they came to the United States also. Pete Hamill said the CIA had, in fact, been the midwife. It even delivered $80,000 to Pope Pius XII in 1950 in an effort to have him issue a pastoral message. He declared it was a mortal sin for Catholics to vote for communists. This is written in the New York News, how the United States government and the CIA had paid $80,000 to Pope Pius XII to influence the Catholics to turn against the Russians and support the Cold War period in the 1950s. Next week I'll go into the Pope Paul VI and his CIA connections and the money he was getting through the Vatican from the Central Intelligence Agency. But even before him, Hamill reminds us that there was 80,000, and I'm sure that is a minimum, there's more than that, to affect the speeches of Pope Paul XII on his what they called the pastoral messages to the Catholics. He says what was the Christian Democratic Party that was formed, the political party, the ally of the Vatican, in 1945 in Italy after the war, those members spent most of World War II right inside the Vatican. He said they were hiding in the Vatican, they were afraid of the communists, and they were fighting the partisans in the north while the communists were fighting there. They were hiding in the Vatican. And when the war was over, the Christian Democrats, who were drowning in corruption and inefficiency, came out and aligned with the Vatican to set up a political party in Italy that worked with the United States and formed the modern Vatican after World War II. He said the Pope is a major partner in the Christian Democratic Party, and the United States provides the bulk of the financial contributions to the modern Vatican aside from its own investments and to Latin America, and the Church supplies the greatest number of human beings. The Vatican has these Catholics in Latin America, and the message from the intelligence community to the Pope comes through the voice of the Pope, but it's a political message paid for by our Central Intelligence Agency. Another article, a UPI story in our papers in the United States, controversy rages over no autopsy. Another group was demanding an investigation into the Pope's death. And in that article, there's an interesting quotation of Cardinal Terence Cook from New York City, who said, "I understand the suspicion of some people, but we are past the point of autopsies. Certainly people are free to discuss the issue. I can understand these matters would be discussed. Some people might feel uneasy that his death was so sudden, but heart attacks or strokes are killers all over the world." We all know that people do die of heart attacks and strokes, but they usually have physical symptoms that go along with that diagnosis, and there was a lot of mystery and contradiction in this particular Pope's death, and that's why the autopsies were required. The Washington Post had another article, "The Vatican Criticized for Lack of Autopsy." This is by Ronald Coven, October the 2nd. "The Vatican's failure to order an autopsy on the body of Pope John Paul was criticized in some quarters yesterday and gave rise to speculation as to a cause of death. For centuries, the palaces or the underground passages of the Vatican have no longer been the setting of criminal actions, but they have been abundantly exploited by popular, vulgar literature." And he goes on, "Just for that reason, because there's been novels and stories about the murders in the Vatican, just for that reason, the window should have become open, and they should have been transparent, and we should have decided to have an autopsy so that there wouldn't be any more rumors about murders in the Vatican." On the other side of this tape, I won't do any more headlines on the death or suspicions of murder, but we'll go into some of the reasons why the people believe that he could have been killed, some comments and editorials, articles. Good evening, this is Mae Brussell. This is Side 2, November 17th, 1978, and this is tape number 363. I might mention that San Francisco Chronicle did have a front story, "Probe into Pope's Death Demanded." The magazine Star said, "Pope poisoning theory pushed." The Washington Post had another one, "Controversy continues over how the Pope died." There were requests from Italy, from Milan, from the Repubblica, a newspaper in Rome, from the University of Madrid, from a Spanish newspaper called El Imparcial, various newspapers asking about the autopsy and investigation into his death, and arguing that they should not avoid facing this because of the nature and suddenness of his death. I bring this up because it's not Mae Brussell who's cooked up some outlandish ideas that the Pope was done in, but there have been newspapers all over the country and all over the world asking these questions and considering who the next Pope was who followed them. It almost makes it mandatory to do a little more research on Pope John Paul I and what is known as the Curia in the Vatican. There was a good article in the San Francisco Examiner from the Night News Service, which goes all over the country. The lead article was called "John Paul's Smile Masked His Fight with Papal Power." It says the smile that Pope John Paul had, that everyone loved so much, masked a lonely man behind the scenes in a struggle by the pontiff to grasp the reins of the church power. Remember, there were 20 that wouldn't even sign that voted him in, the arch-conservatives, the behind-the-scene voting. This article says there's a conviction that this trying, stressful, uncompleted learning process contributed directly to his death. There were the demands for him to accommodate to a job that left him lonely and isolated. He was frustrated. He simply didn't understand the bureaucracy around the Pope. His functions, he was a pastor, he wasn't an administrator. The last papal election left people joyful and happy. Now there is no sun and no one is relaxed now. The Pope the public sees is really only one of the several popes. This is, as I say, night news service. They said he wears many hats. The September Pope struggled to learn what pastoral experience had never taught him. The Italian press speaks now of the tug-of-war within the Vatican on their time and their priorities as Pope. The Curia is a little-known council of power which extends to the political governing of the Vatican, and the Curia was pulling on John Paul. He was constrained by his new position. He was uneasy, and they left him isolated. The article goes on the politics of Vatican and the pressures of John Paul. They said his strength was in his simplicity, that he was a humble man, but his potential weakness, his weakness was that he was too humble and too simple, and he was done in. They suggested that the job doesn't call for humility and simplicity. The pontiff wanted to talk to his weekly audience, and the Curia wouldn't let him. He was persuaded that a pope's duty is only to be seen. He was better to be seen, to be carried on a throne. He wanted to be walking among the people, and they wouldn't let him walk in his own Vatican garden. If Pope John Paul received a letter from a bishop asking for help, his instinct in those 32 days was to answer it. But before he answered it, he was instructed that there had to be an opinion expressed by the Curia, that it is necessary to research the papal president on any question, and he couldn't answer a question from anybody when he received a letter from any bishop. He was muzzled and silenced. This article goes on, this pontiff chafed at the pomp and ceremony. He didn't want an opulent coronation. He dropped the title of Supreme Pontiff. He loved to walk in Venice and talk to people. He could have adjusted to power. He would have come to grips with the Curia. He would have learned where the power was and how to manipulate them, but according to this article, he didn't have the time. Another article by Jack Anderson, October the 13th, 1978. The People's Pope was open to discussion, and he says confidential State Department cables reveal that Pope John Paul I was actively seeking advice from world leaders on social and moral issues in the days before his unexpected death. Anderson said he impressed millions with his moral leadership, which is what the church should have, and his abilities of rare quality, and I add they are indeed rare. He said John Paul was a people's pope, a title he won with affection. He was pursuing channels to communicate with political leaders that would undoubtedly have a significant impact on world problems. This is Jack Anderson. Isn't it a tragedy that every person who could have an impact on our lives, as I say, from Gandhi to John Kennedy and the opening up of dialogue between Russia and the United States with Khrushchev and Kennedy, and various people trying to make peace contacts, whenever we get on the bridge of détente or peace, we're pulled back into this deathly murder the leaders game. Anderson said just before his death, the pontiff died. Just before he died, the State Department of the United States was informed that a congressional delegation could discuss sensitive matters with him, such as population control, hunger, health, and family planning. John Paul accepted as a personal burden the search for solutions to pressing problems of world hunger, disease, unsanitary conditions that threaten the lives of millions in underdeveloped countries. What a contrast with his successor, Pope John Paul II, who in his first speech was saying, be prepared to die for Christ, lashing out violent anti-communists, giving us that same Cold War scare we've had, on and on and on. Los Angeles Times article, one of those good articles by Andrew Greeley, said the lead article was, in his brief time, Pope John Paul moved too fast for some. It said the curial types are not unrelieved by his death. Again, we're going into the Curia. This is the body that makes the political policy in the Vatican. They are not unrelieved by his death. Pope John Paul spent too much time, that was only 33 days, on homilies and too little on the grand political problems. political problems that he was working on, such as population control, hunger, family planning, unsanitary conditions, and disease, those aren't the big problems. They're talking about the grand political problems. He didn't get a chance to worry about too little time on the grand political problems. The LA Times says there were some folks who had taken to censoring his speeches. They did in the Vatican. They told him what he said or couldn't say, and they cut out his speeches those few 33 days. He had to give copies to certain persons in the Curia to read before they were distributed to the press. They cut out his jokes, his anecdotes, his changing of I to the we. They said he moved too fast. He scared them. I'm sure he scared the 20 that didn't vote for him, like the Council of 40. They'll regret his death, but they are happy to return to business as usual. This is written by a Catholic in the Los Angeles Times, that some Curiotypes are not unrelieved, that they'll regret him, but they're back to business as usual in the Vatican. Sinister Romans, he said, are hinting of poison, an absurd charge that cannot be refuted because there was no autopsy. That's written by Andrew Greeley in the Los Angeles Times. The Washington Post has an article on elections in the Vatican. It said the purpose of the conclave isn't to blacken John Paul's name, now that they have their next conclave, but to try and overcome the resistance of certain cardinals, and elect as Pope a fellow who is part of the Church's central government at the Vatican. Cardinal Cyril was mentioned because he said this would be a more thoughtful conclave than letting the last Pope in the way he slipped in. It is necessary to seek a shepherd of the souls, according to Cardinal Hoffner of Cologne, but with greater managerial experience. John Paul's pastoral qualities are fundamental, but there must also be other considerations, the understanding of international problems, and experience as a diplomat. You see, they elected the wrong guy, but they caught on after 30 days. The Dean of Sacred College of Cardinals listed certain criticisms heard around Rome of John Paul's brief reign, and the list was not just the criteria for what would be a new pope, but the shortcomings of the old pope. That kind of talk used to go on in private whispers in the Vatican. They left satirical cartoons around, like a front-page cartoon of one of the magazines in Rome showed him as reading a magazine, and inside the magazine was a Mickey Mouse comic book that he was supposed to be reading as if he was simple-minded. And then they suggested that Cardinal Benelli of Florence was pouring a vial of poison into a cup of tea. They had a picture of him, and in the background, stretched out in bed, was John Paul reading a popular Roman magazine, but inside was a Mickey Mouse comic book. So on the one hand, they have him being poisoned by the cardinals, and the other because he is so simplistic. Andrew Greeley, as I noted, had 3 excellent articles on the Vatican. He had an article October the 15th, "The Pope Has Turned a Corner," and he goes into the problems and the conflicts of the Catholic Church in modern society and talks about the battle lines of democracy versus freedom, that the Catholic Church fights certain truths and has held back certain rights of people because of the nature of their religion, that the worldview takes giant steps into human progress, and the Church thinks that these steps are an assault on Christian truth, that in the world of science we see it as liberating mankind from superstition, and the Church feels that the Bible and religious truths cannot be tested according to scientific data, that they have to be accepted on trust as fact, and the power of the Pope comes through certain absolute powers, and he gives orders out to the Catholics in the world with absolute powers, where the world, real world, sees the papal power as a dark age of oppression. And Andrew Greeley goes into the conflict of the battle lines, that these are the battle lines, and he says Some Catholics now want to rejoin the world and give the Catholic Church a place in the living world, where the Pope, once that is the defender of the rights of the poor a long, long time ago, long ago, spoke as if it could be a democratic institution. He says, along came Pius the Ninth, Pius the Tenth, the 11th, Pius the 12th, and all of them wiped out any openness and destroyed the lives of many decent Romans and went into 4 decades of Catholic history and white terror. Anyway, says this new Pope can slow down but can't reverse the entry of Catholics into the world, but he's not sure, and he says that the changing of the popes will make a big difference into whether we stay in the past or whether the Curia and the new power, the political power and the clout, can keep the Catholic Church back like it's been kept for so many, many years. He says even if the new Pope is committed to integrating that Catholic Church more fully into the modern world, he will never be able to do so unless he is free to govern effectively, and to do that, he has to have some counterweight to what is known as the Roman Curia. The Curia is compared in these articles of Greeley. He explains what it is. It's a new word if you don't study the Catholic Church, the Curia. He says it's not different than any other bureaucracy. It's similar to when the President of the United States have tried, and he uses the example of John Kennedy, have tried with little success to bring the White House under the control of America and the federal agencies. He said presidents, popes, mayors, newspaper editors, college deans come and go, that men who process papers and stamp documents, exchange memos, and execute decisions stay on forever. And the Curia is that body of people that pass memos back and forth and execute decisions and decide if presidents like John Kennedy survive or if popes like Pope John Paul I are allowed to survive or not. This one article in the Los Angeles Times said that Pope John the 23rd, who again was in office from 1958 to June of 63, found some balance of power in a mini-curia which he created when he was the Pope. Pope John Paul I had said that the counterforce against him was pulling him down, and it was without balance. And he said, in quotes, without balance, you are the Curia's prisoner. He said it's not because the Curia is a bad bureaucracy, but because it is a bureaucracy. The Curia inside the Vatican lost out in the election of John Paul I, and now they're being blamed for the death of John Paul I. And there's this talk of poison. This is again in the Los Angeles Times articles, and others are charging the Curia with isolating Pope John Paul I so much that the burden of his office destroyed him. In the past, the Curia was put in the role of the reactionary, heavy, and papal election problems. And in this particular case, with 20 of them not voting, Pope John Paul I got in, but now they're being blamed, some of them, for his death, and then they could control the election the next time around. The Los Angeles Times article goes on and says, the Curia are not evil men. They are doing what they think is their job, which I might add, and isn't in the article, is like the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages or during the Inquisition or the period of concentration camps, or turning their cheeks away to the notorious Ustashi group and the genocide and the torture following World War II and during the World War. And we don't have to go into what the Catholic Church condoned in Central and South America to native populations and the genocidal policies that took over there. The article in the Times says that the Curia are not evil men. They're doing what they think is their job. Their job is often not the same as their chief executive thinks is their job. The Curia in Rome had complained that Pope John Paul spent too much time on his sermons, not enough time and attention to their briefings of his world problems. But the fact is that the Curia didn't even vote for him, so they had reason to dislike him before he became the Pope, and it wasn't that he wasn't looking at world problems, it's just that he wasn't the man that they wanted in the office. Andrew Greeley referred to the Curia in the Vatican as stage managers, and when Pope John Paul was in, and remember, just 33 days, he wanted to see people, and they herded people away from him, and they strove to keep him away from the masses that he loved and to maintain to some of that old monarchical dignity. He would call to the kids in the audience, and he would talk to them just as he did when he walked around the streets of Venice. He loved people, and he showed it, and the Curia wanted to separate him, which is a way of just killing him before he actually died. The blue pencil pushers, according to Andrew Greeley, censored, as I said, his public statements. They made them more formal. They had security folks around him. Security folks, again, I think, of the guarding of our presidents and congressmen and so forth before their assassinations. He had security folks, and they even prevented him from walking in the garden in the Vatican, which he liked to do. He liked to walk in the garden. They cut out his speeches. They cut out his audiences, his contact with people. The blue pencil pushers censored his statements. The security folks wouldn't let him walk in the garden. I mean, here was a man who would be trusted and loved by everybody, and they didn't have much time to rub up against him. The result of all their well-meant intervention was to make him a virtual prisoner. These 33 days, you don't think of the happy John Paul I living and smiling out the 33 days as being tortured, but they gave him the isolation treatment in preparation. Andrew Greeley says they were going to teach him how the church worked. He said, "Holy Mother of God," he told one of his friends, "I know nothing." When he got the job of Pope, he had no idea how it was really run. The bureaucracies are conservative, Greeley says. They are used to established ways of doing things. They have to be pushed and pulled into changing them, whether they're universities or corporations or newspapers or governments, whether they're civil or ecclesiastical, and every new executive meets the challenge of how to make a change against that old bureaucracy. The actual meaning of Curia is three things. One, the conservative cardinals, mostly Italians. The other are the cardinals working in Rome who are not Italian but are living in Rome for some reason. And the third are the professional administrators of the church. And those are one, I suppose, that take care of the pocketbooks and the investments. And what's good for the Vatican, I'm sure, isn't always good for the native population. A Catholic, Andrew Greeley, was writing in the Los Angeles Times, there are many conspiracies inside of the Curia, as there are in any corporate bureaucracy in the world. The Curia is not a monolithic conspiracy. The new pope will have to solve some of the same problems that killed Pope John Paul I. Andrew Greeley is concerned about this new pope and how many orders he'll be taking from the Curia, and he says that he'll have to have some balance, a neutral space in there. Otherwise, he said, this next pope will not govern. He will be passed around the stormy seas of bureaucratic guerrilla warfare. This is written by a man, a Roman Catholic priest himself, who warned us that this time that may not have a religious experience, that the new pope coming in may not be a religious experience, and he says that if he doesn't have control of his own, he will be passed around the stormy seas of bureaucratic guerrilla warfare. Another article, October the 14th in the Washington Post, titled "The Vatican Campaign Cast John Paul as a Poor Administrator." And they said, as an effective head of the church, he created resentments among the fellow cardinals, the cardinals who may consider that John Paul was, on reflection, not the right choice at all, and they're burdened by a large measure of their responsibility in having somebody that couldn't handle the Curia. In other words, a man was elected that many priests from the Third World or the moderates believed in, but they're partly responsible because what they called a good administrator means a hard-ass fascist couldn't get along with a hard bunch who are really running the world today and have been running it for a long, long time. The Post said Luciani's smiling countenance was a refreshing change of pace for many of the faithful, and the obvious craving of Catholics for a less intellectually distant pope than Paul VI, and they hoped that they would get somebody who was warm and fun-loving. And the terrible, terrible tragedy is that having this Pope Paul VI, I refer to him as the OSS Montini Pope, he wasn't that much fun, and he was heavily into politics and fascism and the whole Cold War period that has been going on since he was in 1963. And it's just a shame that the whole world has to see a decent person knocked out continuously. It does hurt. It hurts the young people, it hurts the older people, and anyone with any sensitivity to see these people just slain right in front of you. And of course, what they say in the articles in the newspaper are not that he wasn't a hard fascist fighting heavier forces. They blame him as a poor administrator because he couldn't handle the curia. And yet his speeches were curtailed, his interviews with people were curtailed, his walks in the garden. He was isolated. It was enough to give you a heart attack or blood pressure, but the symptoms on his face and that smile and the inactivity, the way he died with that smile and holding his papers and so forth, as I said, looks more like poison than a stroke or a heart attack. But it's just a shame that this kind of person can't survive against those strong people in an organization that should be serving the needs of all the Catholics of the world. And I'm not anti-Catholic, and I want to say that now. I believe there's a handful of people in the Jewish religion, among the Mormons, the Catholic Church, and so forth, that follow the world fascists, help put them into power, and they don't represent the masses of people at all. I don't in any way want you to think I'm anti-Catholic by what I'm saying, and what I'm quoting here are newspapers that are certainly not judged as being anti-Catholic in their position, and I'm sharing some of the articles that went on. Next week I will do a tape on Pope John Paul II, the man that succeeded the one that we've talked about on this tape, John Paul I, and I'll go into the mentor of John Paul II again, Mr. Montini, who became Pope Paul VI, who was really the godfather of the current Pope. And let me remind you one more time what Andrew Greeley said, that the coalition of the really decent popes, decent cardinals with the fascist element in the Vatican could fall apart, and he said, and quote, "This time it may not be a religious experience for anyone." On the back, on the remaining part of this tape, I just want to mention a letter that I wrote to Mr. John Stanish, Department of Justice, the Office of Pardon Attorney in Washington, D.C., 20530, and this has to do with Patty Hearst, because those of you that have followed my work know how long I've been researching the Patty Hearst SLA story and trying to get her out of prison, and I've been trying to expose the links of the CIA and the FBI to the creation of the Symbionese Liberation Army. November the 6th, 1978, I wrote, "Dear Mr. Stanish, since my last letter to you, September the 27th, 1978, I've been in touch with Mr. Dothard Perry. Mr. Perry wrote several articles about the SLA and contacted me a year ago regarding his FBI teletypes on the SLA. I reminded Mr. Stanish that Dothard Perry was with Patty Hearst the day before the shootout in Los Angeles, that he worked for the FBI for 8 years, that he had teletypes proving that the Los Angeles Police Department and the FBI had foreknowledge of the killing of Dr. Marcus Foster, the school board chairman in Oakland, and that they had foreknowledge of the kidnapping of Patty Hearst, and that these documents were available if he wanted them, and that they knew for 16 months where Patty Hearst was in the summer of 1974 and through 75. And I said, when you're working on the petition for commutation of sentence for Patty Hearst, keep in mind that more people will hopefully surface. I haven't yet figured out, I said in the letter, why Randolph Hearst hasn't filed a suit for $2 million against the Oakland Police Department or the FBI for kidnapping his daughter and making him put out $2 million for that phony counterintelligence operation. And then I said, how can you keep Patricia Hearst in one more day? What is your bottom line through this legal maze of stalling time? Where is your decency? I suggest that you get going with your paperwork and allow her to walk out of prison immediately. Signed, Mae Brussell, and I sent another copy to President Jimmy Carter at the White House, and I sent this letter to FBI Director William Webster. I dated it. It was sent out November the 6th, 1978, and that was a Monday, and I assume was in Washington by Wednesday or Thursday. But Monday of this week, on the 13th of November, I heard that Patty Hearst will be out by Christmas, and I just wonder if this kind of putting on the line just exactly what they know already about the Hearst case causes them to move faster. I don't think that petitions for getting out have a great effect, but then it can look like the masses wanted it or the people wanted it. I think the only thing that moves these bastards is the information that these documents exist and that there could be lawsuits and they're available for lawsuits. And I think they run scared because they're a bunch of cowards. I don't have any particular knowledge of Patty Hearst personally. I've never met her. I was supposed to go up and see her. I haven't been up to the prison to see her, and I've never met her family. They've never been interested in my research, and as a matter of fact, Delthard Perry wanted to make an arrangement to meet them and wanted something like $50 or $60 for his transportation to come to meet them, and I don't even think the Hearst people were interested in putting up the money to see the copies of the documents that he has, that he was with Patricia the day before the shootouts. I don't understand the minds of those people, but the fact remains that if the counterintelligence operation works and gets away with it in one case, they can do it in many, many other cases. And I just continuously want to expose the tentacles of our society that are so false and are used by the media and created by the media and are nursed along and founded in Washington, D.C., in the Pentagon and in the intelligence community, and then permeate our local society and individuals in our local society. In closing this tape, I just want to warn you about a very important subject that I'll be going into at length when we finish this series on the Vatican and the new Pope John Paul II. If you can go to the library and get a hold of the Boston Globe, November the 12th, 1978, it's about the secret Hughes Medical Institute, which I have said over and over again is probably the number one problem in the United States that will bring us into a total fascism with its secrecy. They're opening up a large medical institute. They're moving from Florida and secrecy into Boston, where they're going to have 12 medical institutes and facilities centered around the country, and they'll be connected by satellite from one institute to the other, where they will study genetics, immunology, endocrinology, and metabolism. And I will do more on this later, but in the meantime, if you go to a library, you can photocopy or ask for this copy or write to the Boston Globe, Sunday, November the 12th, 1978. I worry about the Central Intelligence Agency, secret hospitals and experiments, and the spreading of these hospitals by satellite, and it isn't a far cry away from Dachau and Auschwitz, the hometown of Pope John Paul II. We'll get back to him next week.